Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, a national security podcast that provides you an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world and ask how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's September 29th, 2025. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
Good, Eric. I'm actually pretty bouncy. For anyone who's been following my journey, I have, after a whole bunch of chemo, I've successfully knocked the cancer back enough to get to surgery.
Hell yeah.
Later in October. And then in order to do that, I've decided I ought to do some prehab because everyone says the stronger you go into surgery, the better the surgery outcome is. So after way too much time being a slug, I've now hired a trainer. And so I'm pretty excited about that. Although it does force you to deal with what you aren't right now. Maybe it's good for keeping my ego in check, but it's awesome to do training. I love sweating. I just never thought I'd sweat lifting 5-pound weights in the air.
If you do it enough times, right? 10 times, 5, it's the same amount of work as picking up 50 once.
You're so good to me. And then the other thing is my fever, without Caitlin Clark, made it to the second round of the playoffs. They're in the semifinals, best of 5. And against all odds, they've tied the series 2-2 against the Aces, which actually is why I really love sports. Because you can think all you want about who's going to win, but until you play, you just don't know who's going to come that day and succeed that day. And so, one, it's fun to watch the Fever, who have been decimated by injury, continue to thrive. But the other is just it's wicked fun to see what's going to happen. So that's me. How about you?
I have a confession to make. I did put up Halloween decorations before October 1st. Oh, yeah. To great fanfare. It was a hit. And as we predicted last week, the kids just ran smashing through them. And it's a wonder that they don't have holes in them now.
You have a ghost?
Big ghost, yep. Big inflatable ghost, and then a little inflatable cat. Yep, we caved. Across the street neighbors, kids about the same age. They put theirs up yesterday morning, and the kids have been bugging me all week. And I was like, October 1st, October 1st. And October 1st will be this week, and it is the first weekend before October 1st. So
giving your kids a win is always super important. I mean, not all the time, but this one's good. And look at you. You're happy. I can tell.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun.
Good for you.
It's arbitrary October 1st.
Yeah, but you know what? Next year, it's going to be earlier.
It'll be September. Labor Day, time to put up the Halloween decorations.
Exactly.
All right. Let's get to some headlines. This week in the threat picture, we'll catch up on a few items we've been discussing of late. A telecommunications threat that was uncovered last week in New York City, approaching the UN meetings. And finally, we'll discuss Turkey and President Erdogan's visit with President Trump, one of our oldest NATO allies in a key geographic location. We'll start with some of our catch-up in the pending government shutdown. CBS News reports the president privately welcomes the prospect of a shutdown because it will enable him to wield executive power to slash some government programs and salaries. A memo shared with Politico last week from the Office of Management and Budget echoes this claim, with preparations for reduction in forces. So how's this government shutdown looking different than ones we've seen previously?
Well, it's just as bad as it always is in one way. It's made a little worse by just the rhetoric that always surrounds it about whose fault it is. It's just a more hyper-partisan environment right now, and basically no time. It's the 29th of September. I guess it's different because it's louder and shorter, but it is always bad. You and I have talked about this before. The Congress has one job to do it. When I bemoan the hyperpartisanship, part of that is I am sick of straight party line votes. How can that be that every single representative of every single state has the exact same view on what we need to do as a nation? And if it goes on those lines, I just don't know how you come to any real resolution. So That's maybe a way that it's different. It just feels too extreme, that there's no room, that everyone's drawn their line. It's unfortunate our leaders are willing to represent positions that may not be borne up by the facts. That's hard for the American people to sort out. But besides that, let's just talk about the real damage it does. Because heck, I can't predict which way it's going to go. I probably think the government will shut down because I think the president knows exactly what the Democrats are asking for, and it's a very reasonable thing. Actually, I think he could have aligned himself behind it if he had wanted to, but it's just not going to happen. What's terrible about it is two things. It disrupts the services that the government provides, and not just once it's shut down. As soon as you know this is going to happen, every agency has to do planning to know how they're going to shut it down, what they're going to deem as essential, what they're not going to deem as essential, communicate that with their people, get all the paperwork ready. And beyond that, every single business entity that does work with the U.S. government is sitting there waiting to know what the effect on them will be. The effect on our overall, not only conduct of business, but economy is massive in ways that it's just are kind of unseen. People see that the parks are shut down, but this is just infinite number of small decisions
Mm-hmm.
about companies. What work do they have to cancel? What people do they have to furlough because they can't pay them? And especially as this follows from the things that happen with Doge, everyone's much tighter now anyway, so there just isn't much room for anyone to cover. So that's one, just the effect on business. And then the second is the human toll is so profound. The people who serve their country, and we talk about this, not everyone is over the moon patriots. I guess some people think that a government job is a job. That's not generally my experience. But to have your work debated over whether it's essential or not, to be told you're not necessary and you can go home. And now this year to layer on the possibility that in retribution for it shutting down at all, maybe used as an excuse for OMB to decide that it's just going to eliminate those positions. These are people who did real
Yep.
work, who applied for a job, who did it every day, and now are being jerked around in the most, I'm just going to say, public and inhumane way. And they're just your neighbors and your folks trying to decide whether they're going to be able to get through a shutdown and how long is the shutdown going to be. And the number of people that live paycheck to paycheck in America
Yep.
is huge.
Yeah, it's like 62 to 73% or something like that.
Yeah, so if they don't get a paycheck for a week, they're now really worried about what they're going to be able to do about that. It feels so irresponsible to me when it's the one job the Congress has, when we've known about this for a long time. I don't even understand how you send the House home rather than working through it. I don't know how you say we're not going to have conversations. I mean, yeah, there's going to be a conversation with the president today, but isn't this what the House and Senate are supposed to work through together? So it's reprehensible as well as irresponsible.
Yep. And I think we've gotten a little bit numb to it because it's the normalization of deviance because we expect this every end of September, but it doesn't change the fact that it is really hard on those individuals that get furloughed, and none of it's a light switch. As soon as you turn off the government, it doesn't all come right back on as soon as you've turned the budget back on.
And if they pass a short-term continuing resolution, if you think that stops this, it doesn't.
No.
Right? Because at some point they have to come through to the end. It just actually prolongs it. And so of all the things we as a government do to ourselves, this is the one that over the years has just come to represent to me just a profound lack of understanding of by our leadership about what it takes to actually do the job of the nation.
All right. Next thing we've been watching, James B. Comey, the former FBI director, has been indicted by a federal grand jury on allegations that he lied before Congress under oath in September of 2020. This indictment asserts that Mr. Comey falsely claimed during a hearing before the committee that he had not authorized anyone in the FBI to leak information to the news media about an investigation into an unnamed person. The case was brought forward by a new U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, Lindsay Halligan, who was appointed by President Trump on Monday, last week. So timing is significant here. To me, it appears to be more of a de facto extension because they were coming up
Right.
on the 5-year statute of limitations to prosecute Comey for allegedly making these false statements, and that expires tomorrow, Tuesday the 30th. Sue, what is your reaction to this story and former Director Comey being indicted?
I don't have any inside knowledge about the facts of the case. It troubles me, and you and I have talked about this several times. Chasing the ghosts of the past, the retribution tour, chasing a guy when the president was elected in 2016, and we're talking about congressional hearings not on the topic of the Russia investigation. What are we doing here? And why is the president concerned at all with this? So that's one concern. I have to fess up. I didn't think this indictment, much like any of the others, could ever happen.
Yeah.
I think I even predicted that all those indictments wouldn't happen because I just didn't think there was enough of a predicate. It's a little troubling that insufficiency seemed to be articulated by the former head of the Eastern District, who said there wasn't enough to bring the case, and then he
Yeah.
is removed, and then you put someone in who days later brings the case. So that's a little worrisome to me that maybe we're having a further erosion within the FBI and the Justice Department about what our standards are. Now it's going to play out. Comey has made it clear that he's willing to fight the fight in the process through the court system. What we all should watch for is, does it actually go to trial? Because there is one more step here that says the judge can determine whether there's sufficient cause to bring it to trial. I don't think it's good. If it does go to trial, you're just going to see a whole bunch of others come. And again, my concern is it selective prosecution?
Hmm.
And then two, what are we spending our time on? And look at the things that we have to do as a nation. Just the world is still kind of a hot mess. We have a lot of economic concerns. We have our own things that we need to do within our cities. We have healthcare, all the things you and I have talked about that seem to be much more worthy of conversation than something that happened years ago that didn't affect an outcome. But I guess we'll see.
If it does go to trial, it's going to get into a lot of the semantic stuff. I feel like we're going to have another debate over what the definition of is and legalese and stuff. But on the other hand, let's let the judicial process run its course and trust the process.
In general, the reason we have systems is if the systems are allowed to work the way they do, they generally tend to do their job. The worrisome feature right now is you seem to have people who are willing to put their thumb on the scale at various points. Generally have confidence in the system now. We need to watch a bit, but it hasn't run its course yet.
The next one we wanted to follow up on was TikTok. So
Yeah.
on Thursday, President Trump signed an executive order titled Saving TikTok While Protecting National Security. We talked about this significantly last week in our episode with Shannon Corliss. But the plan ensures that TikTok has undergone a qualified divestiture and meets the requirements of the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act that was signed back into law on April 24th of 2024. Sue, what were your thoughts on TikTok so far?
I don't think I was surprised by it. Maybe one of my biggest concerns about government today in this administration, particularly, is government, you usually see the data of what supports it, or the data behind the deal, or what are the actual terms of it, or what does the jobs report look like? And we get assertions
Yeah.
more than we get data. So on the one hand, we've been heading toward this, and on the top line looks pretty good in the hands of a U.S. company, data being held and protected here, board members being overwhelmingly of U.S. members. That all sounds good, but then I start worrying about who's getting the money, how much is the government involved in that choice, what agreements were made to it. I mean, one of the greatest things about America is this line we've had between the private sector and the government that oftentimes is in tension. We've seen it in security cases being in tension where the government wants data that companies won't give them. We see the tension when you're trying to fight over what a merger makes sense and one which becomes monopolization. But it feels like the US is getting so much more financially involved in private companies, and I don't think much good comes from actual US government control, whether through participation or through investment in what private companies do. I just think it's a slippery slope that we're going down. Let's take a look in terms of what the terms of the deal turn out to be, in terms of who's getting money, who are they answering to, and how things get executed. So we just make sure that we aren't crossing the line of intermixing government and private sector. And remember, one of the reasons why we wanted this divestiture of TikTok was because in China, they blur that line between the government and the private sector. And the government can insert itself into what the private sector does. And that's one of the reasons why we have a problem with Chinese companies being insinuated into our businesses here, not because we mind the companies, but because we don't want the activities that go through those products and services to be immediately handed over to the Chinese government. So stay tuned to this channel as the deal plays out. I'd love to see the finances.
Yeah, and there is precedent there. We've already talked about it just in this administration alone. 15% of the revenue from AMD and NVIDIA sales in China will go to the U.S. government. And then also we talked about extensively the 10% equity stake that the U.S. is taking in Intel.
And even the way it was decided on which companies would get TikTok. I mean, this is a huge boon financially. And so there are like two ways it seems to be doing business. One is just free and open competition and lots of transparency and lots of processes to make sure that things aren't happening unless the administration is involved and then they're dictating what happens. And so it feels like our system is changing, but not in a systemic way, not in a transparent way, not necessarily in a way that anyone can get access to it if you don't have access to the consequential people in the administration. It's a change. It is not how we've been before.
Halliburton got a lot of contracts after we invaded Iraq. Cheney was closely aligned with them.
When I went over to Moscow in '83, when we were building the new embassy there, and I went down to see where all the material was that was being used in the new embassy, it was all from Georgia. And that's when President Carter was in office. So there is, but the scale we're talking about.
Sure.
And again, just because someone did it before is not a reason to do it again. Do you believe in a system that's repeatable, transparent, and fair? That anyone can participate if they meet the standards? Or do you believe in a system where a few people decide what the best thing is, and because of the power they hold, they affect that outcome? It's just different.
And one thing I think is worth keeping an eye on, we've also talked a lot about how the data will be stored in the U.S. and pulling out an excerpt from the executive order, that's not necessarily as clear to me. So I'll just read this to you real quick. The divestiture prohibits the storage of sensitive United States user data in a manner that would place such data under the control of a foreign adversary and requires such data be stored in a cloud environment run by an American company.
It even gets murkier, where in subsequent announcements they said ByteDance will still have a significant role. What does that mean?
Yeah. We want the stack to be on U.S. soil, right?
I
The
do.
physical cloud where it's housed to be there, not in a storage facility anywhere else in the world, especially not China, right? Because then they have access to all of it. But we want it to be in the U.S. And that was kind of our maybe assumption or at least understanding.
Again, not to make everything, but one of the things you worry about is who are the people advising these deals?
Yeah.
Are they political appointees, or are we missing the people that might have had some expertise in this, but they've been eliminated in some of the previous cuts?
Yeah.
On October 1st, we'll lose 100,000 federal employees because that's when their deferred retirement kicks in. there are jobs that are done, so who is advising these? Think about Shannon Corliss and listen to her and her being in those meetings deciding on what should be put in versus some other people, and we just don't know whether that's a position of strength anymore for the federal government or not, so that worries me a little too.
Yep. We'll keep an eye on it.
Yep.
Well, what about Venezuela?
Huh.
Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro wrote to President Donald Trump on September 6th, 4 days after the first U.S. strike killed 11 on the first alleged drug boats out of Venezuela. In the letter, he reportedly offered to engage in direct talks with Special Envoy Richard Grenell, and he is sending the U.S. what he refers to as, quote, compelling data on drug production and drug trafficking that demonstrates that Venezuela is a territory free of drug production. The Trump administration has accused Maduro of being one of the world's largest narco traffickers and of working with cartels to flood the U.S. with fentanyl-laced cocaine. We did not mention previously that the United States has offered a reward for Maduro's arrest that's been in place since 2020. Initially, the reward was up to $15 million for information leading to arrest and or conviction of Maduro. And on January 10th, 2025, they increased the reward offer up to $25 million. And then on August 7th of this year, further increased the reward up to $50 million after the Department of Treasury sanctioned the Cartel of the Suns as a specially designated global terrorist. As alleged leader of the Cartel of Suns, Maduro is the first target in the history of the narcotics rewards program with a reward offer exceeding $25 million. So is this development progress, or is it validation of our previous discussion regarding potential regime change?
Since his first administration, President Trump has wanted to take action in Venezuela. It's just been a focus for many reasons, the violence, the drugs. I don't think the letter hurts. The letter is not a bad delaying tactic. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think it changes the overall trajectory of what the U.S. is pursuing. Although, Eric, can you clearly articulate what the U.S. policy toward Venezuela is?
I cannot.
And has it been discussed in the Congress in hearings? It's a great move by Maduro. Trump would have a hard time not engaging in conversation because of his stated belief that he's supposed to talk to everybody.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll get another peace deal out of this. He can say that he settled the war between the United States and Venezuela. But I don't think that it fundamentally changes his administration's focus
Mm-hmm.
on wanting to do something about Venezuela and about this leader. I wish it were more clearly articulated so I could be more clearly articulate about what I think the elements of it are. I do think the use of naming them terrorists and part of terrorist organizations is a pretty clever way to legitimize the activity
Mm-hmm.
against standards that the U.S. public certainly recognizes as one that the federal government should be involved in. You know, when you hear terrorism, you think imminent threat.
Yeah, but at the origins of these guys, they're not terrorists in my definition, right? The terrorist mission or terrorist goal is to strike fear and disrupt your life through fear. They're bad guys, maybe evil people, but their goal is not fear and ruin our way of life. The drug runners are just trying to make profit. The cartels are just trying to make money.
And again, they're not launching an invasion in the United States. They're supplying our demand. You know, Eric, for my whole career in intelligence, counter narcotics was a huge part. Crime and narcotics, counter narcotics.
Uh-huh.
I don't know that the issues are much different today than they were for all that time and money spent, in part because they tend to be extra state activities, and more, the reason they're successful is because there's a demand for them.
Yeah.
And unless you handle the demand side, you're going to have a hard time dealing with the supply side. Think about China and the South China Sea, and China being a massive power. And basically, it can do whatever it wants in the South China Sea because it's big and strong, and those companies are less big, less strong. And one of the things we always, as a nation, railed against, and this was fundamental to the world order that existed post-World War II, is you don't get to take where you want just because you're big. This has been always something that the U.S. has defended. I'm just not sure how, as a nation, we continue to justify just blowing boats out of the water because we can. But, we talk a lot about how do we put national security issues in context so American citizens know why they should care.
Yeah.
I don't know that this has much of an impact on the average citizen's everyday life. I do think over time, erosion of standing by the nation probably makes us less able to both influence and operate in a way that is in concert with the other free and open societies, but we'll have to see.
100,000 fentanyl-related deaths a year do, though. That does affect our national security and especially at the home front. And I think many of us have an anecdote of someone we know who's died from a fentanyl overdose, right? But I don't know that this action against Venezuela is the most effective way of combating that.
Yeah, and I'm not victim shaming either. I'm just saying you gotta address both ends. Listen, I'm a control the border gal. I love it every time that I hear that we have interdicted fentanyl coming into the United States. We don't talk about it nearly as much because it just doesn't make the news, but a lot of good FBI work going on with state and local trying to disrupt these rings. These are all really good things to do.
Mhm.
I don't know how these relate to that, and I don't know how the action translates into volumetric fixing of the problem you just said. What is that? That number of deaths, it's like a plane fully loaded going down every day in America. That's how many
Yeah.
people are dying. And if we had a plane going down every day, we'd certainly do something about it. So these numbers of people affected by drugs are massive, but the actions we've taken so far don't seem to be the ones that are changing that outcome.
Yeah, for sure. Let's talk about this telco threat. So, as world leaders converged on New York last week for the UN meetings, the Secret Service quietly dismantled a sprawling network of SIM server farms, 300 servers and more than 100,000 SIM cards staged across the New York tri state area and within 35 miles of the UN. This was initially framed as a target against the UN, and given the timing, location, and potential for significant disruption to New York telecommunications posed by these devices, the U.S. Secret Service Advanced Threat Interdiction Unit moved to disrupt this network. This struck me as a much bigger threat than just disrupting cell phones around the UN. In addition to possibly overloading the cell phone towers, these devices could be used to conduct a wide range of telecommunications attack, including facilitating anonymous encrypted communication between potential threat actors and criminal enterprises. While forensic examination of these devices will take time, early analysis indicates connections between nation-state threat actors and individuals that are known to federal law enforcement. So am I overly paranoid that this was part of something bigger?
It's worrisome. I think the location is worrisome. Timing is worrisome where you have the convergence of a lot of world leaders. It is an interesting example of essentially cyber criminals moving from going to endpoints and working at the infrastructure level where the effects can be much more massive. So it's super worth paying attention to for our audience. A SIM farm is really just a collection of servers that have hundreds to thousands of SIM cards that are attached to them. And what you can do is you can basically just simulate almost infinite number of phone calls simultaneously, each with a different number or with an anonymized number. They've been used for fraud. How do you just make a lot of calls that can't be traced, to denial of service attacks where you just overwhelm a network. So it's not a particularly complex idea, but it is an attack on infrastructure. And though it can be criminal and about fraud, it also can be used to basically disrupt communications, take away the legitimate communications, and have only the ability for people to communicate who were prepared to do so. So I don't think we have to over rotate on it. It certainly isn't new. Ukraine had a lot of similar type of SIM farm attacks, say 2020 to 2024, as just a means for the communications to be controlled. So it isn't a brand new thing. It is relatively new Here, it would cause disruption. Imagine it during a trading day,
Hmm.
or imagine
Yeah.
doing it simultaneously in 10 cities around America. So there are things about it that are not complex to do that can have pretty massive effect if it's pulled off. It'll be interesting to see how we kind of unfold, and unspool it and see who did it. They will figure out the origins. Interesting, Eric, sometimes we catch things happening in digital space when people make an error. What I think is interesting about this is if this was actually a targeted attack on New York City during the UN General Assembly, that sounds like it was actually operational, not
Hmm.
just test. If that wasn't the case, if they were just trying it out on a lark, they've kind of wasted an opportunity because now we'll be prepared for the sorts of things. All the signatures that the Secret Service used to collect it will now be distributed everywhere, so that will find it. Or it was actually tested someplace else where we didn't catch it, and we wrote it off as just an outage. This bears watching, and it plays into our larger issue of so much of our digital infrastructure is local. If you're not in New York for the UN General Assembly with the Secret Service, who does Chicago have? Who's looking at their networks? Who does San Francisco have? Who does Atlanta have? It is an interesting question if we're now moving to infrastructure attacks. How are we protecting our infrastructure at state and local level? Because that's where the action actually usually is.
That's why I think they moved on it at the time because of the potential threat to the UN meeting and that many heads of state and dignitaries in the city and the possibility to overload the network. But reportedly, where it evolved from, there were telephonic threats to multiple senior U.S. officials in the past spring, including multiple people protected by the Secret Service. And so that's what triggered the investigation. And then more recently, they went to move on it. So maybe lend some credibility to the idea that they were using as a broader targeting or information campaign.
Yeah, maybe, or maybe part of terror and you can't trust it. Interesting to see how this one plays out.
All right. We'll be watching that. Now we want to go back and look at a meeting from last week between President Erdogan of Turkey met with President Trump at the White House last Thursday, September 25th. Turkey has been a U.S. treaty ally for more than 7 decades, joining NATO in 1952. Geography is key. Nuclear weapon sites during the Cold War were part of the run-up to the Bay of Pigs with the Soviet Union. Incirlik Air Base and access to Turkish airspace have made Ankara central to alliance operations from the Middle East to the Black Sea, but the relationship has been strained. In 2020, the U.S. actually sanctioned Turkey under the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which doesn't sound like a very good ally title, after they bought Russia's S-400 air defense system, and they were subsequently kicked out of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program. After last week, Boeing looks like they're the big winner, with an order of 787 Dreamliners from Turkish Air coming out of the meeting. President Erdogan also cited, quote, meaningful progress. However, no tangible movements seem to come out related to Russian oil sales or being brought back into the F-35 fold. So, Sue, what was your reaction to the president's meeting with Erdogan last week?
Well, Eric, I just want to kind of foot stomp on what you said on how important Turkey has been historically, geopolitically, regionally, militarily to the United States. Incredibly capable, located in a strategically significant area, a NATO ally. The Incirlik Air Base is one that we have used for almost all our operations with the agreement of Turkey. Turkish military fighting forces, when they fight with us, are some of the very best around. So incredibly important to us. And so, kind of my first reaction is excellent. We need to have a relationship with Turkey. Erdogan is an interesting leader because of what's happened in Turkey since 2016 and kind of the way he has led in a much more authoritarian way. And we can talk more about that. But in the broadest strokes, This is a relationship that we have to maintain. It's interesting that, as you mentioned, they got part of what they were hoping for, but not all of it because we haven't seen movement on the president's asks of them. This is a complex relationship. I wasn't overly thrilled with the lauding of Erdogan as being tough and strong, especially in light of what he's doing within Turkey itself. And it plays a little bit into our president having more affinity for the strongmen of the world rather than the free and open societies. But it is a relationship that there is very good reason that we maintained. Incredibly important partner in the Middle East for any of the things that we want to do there.
Yeah, absolutely. And overall, this meeting is a good opportunity to take a closer look at Turkey, a country we don't talk about that often as an ally, again, with interest in both Europe, the Middle East, and Russia. And I don't think we can properly do a national security analysis without looking closer at their domestic picture, like you mentioned, and where the country has been under President Erdogan, spelled Erdogan, pronounced Erdogan.
Yeah.
Since the failed coup in July of 2016, Turkey has concentrated power in the presidency. They got rid of their prime minister. Since then, they conducted mass government purges, prolonged emergency rule. They've shrinked their press space and pushed a, quote, enemy within narrative. As we were looking at them over the last decade or so, we were reminded of Umberto Eco. Eco was an Italian political scientist. He was born in 1932 in Italy and came of age during Mussolini's government. In 1995, he published a theory of government called Ur-Fascism, or eternal fascism. The Ur prefix meaning original or primordial. For him, many forms of fascism throughout history have had significant contradictions, and that, quote, fascism became an all-purpose term because one can eliminate from a fascist regime one or more features and it will still be recognizable as fascist. Nazism had a theory of racism and the Aryan chosen people. Nazism was decidedly anti-Christian and neo-pagan. Contrast that with Spanish fascism and Franco's hyper-Catholic phalangelism, or Mussolini and Italian fascism. Mussolini was a militant atheist at the beginning, and then later he always cited the name of God in his speeches and did not mind being called the man of Providence. So all fascists, but many features contradict themselves. Totalitarianism doesn't really work well either, he says, because if by totalitarianism one means a regime that subordinates every act of the individual to the state and its ideology, then both Nazism and Stalinism were true totalitarian regimes. Well, that doesn't work. So he came up with these 14 features of Ur-Fascism that kind of transcends across these different governments. And so we're not going to get into all 14, but wanted to talk about a couple of the different ones present in Turkey. And while still a democracy, still maintaining regular elections, they've started to consolidate some of that power and exhibit some tendencies of Ur-Fascism. What do you think?
Well, one really nice summary of Ur-Fascism, better than I could have done. It's a pretty dense read, but it's an interesting one. If you bounce up to the 10,000-foot level, even though there are lots of different flavors of it, there are common approaches that leaders use to consolidate power, to take more under their control. And certainly Erdogan has done that since 2016. The ones that we'd probably focus on, his appeal to the frustrated middle class. Their party's AKP's long-running message blends social conservatism with economic uplift and resentment towards the secular elites. And you energize these people to say that you can restore what they believe they've lost. And you do it on the ordinary citizens as being the real power of the country from people who have taken from them, who are different from them, who are nerdy elites. That's one that he has used incredibly effectively. One of the things that I'm really focused on, and I think we maybe mentioned last time, was judicial constraint and supernatural defiance, right? Are two things that he mentions. And it's detentions of opponents and just trying to create a super nationalistic view of the rights and the approach and the theory of the case that you have that is very particular, both internally, where you're able to suppress the people, and internationally, where you're basically just asserting your right to do this. Another is traditionalism and rejection of modernism, withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention on violence against women, and suspension of Western-style NATO non-governmental organization influence by saying we don't need this, right? We're gonna go back to how we've been before. Popular elitism, contempt for the weak, have all become things that are hallmarks of the Erdogan rise of power. And then one more is this idea of the real citizens. There are the real citizens of Turkey, and then there are all the others. And that distinction of who's real, which is really just the classic us versus them, those are things that he has used to consolidate his power. And then as you look at it into coming elections, you really are laying the groundwork where you continue what you've done before. So there's just some really interesting things to look at with Turkey still being a democracy, but having these elements of Ur-Fascism. And where do they end? And once you are being effective in consolidating power through these means, are you ever going to give it up for fear of losing power of your base? There's a book called How to Lose a Country by a woman named Essie Telmakuran, where she writes about the activities in Turkey since 2016, and it's a really interesting story. She's a combination of poet and journalist, so it's a really readable, short book that'll do a much better job than I did about talking about how it felt to the citizens during those years if they weren't in one of the groups that was being highlighted, and how they felt about becoming an other in their own country. Really interesting.
You talked about the boiling frog before, and I think each of these elements in isolation, from not allowing the NGOs in or repeal from the Istanbul Convention or some of these things, starting to call your political opponents terrorists or the enemy, those all don't seem that bad on their own, or you think of it as a one-off. But when you look at them all together and you start to aggregate them, you can really see this transition that Turkey is moving to, more authoritarian, how Erdogan's kept the grip on the country, because he has had political opponents. He's come pretty close to losing the election in the past, but now he's pretty well consolidated there.
I hate labels, but it's kind of the fascist playbook. Through actions that seem almost normal for someone who has won an election to then decide that they are going to govern by doing these things, and is it different from strengthening their base, or is it eroding the principles that created a democracy? That's why it's an instructive look, because Turkey is an ally and partner that we need. So how do you maintain who you are while still having a relationship with others? And then we're not going to talk about today, but there are some elements of this that if you took a squint at what's happening here, you can see there are elements that are the same. And again, boy, it's a fine line between what you're doing to just strengthen your party and what you're doing to erode the people's will
Yep.
capacity. It feels like we've had a little bit of a depressing episode this time. I just think that's where we are right now. A lot of uncertainty, a lot of balls in the air, a lot of things that are different from what's been before, and we've just got to see how it plays out. What we always try and do is to not over-rotate on things not yet in evidence, but tell people what to watch and pay attention to it, and we try to highlight the potential effects. We aren't prognosticators of what will happen, but we do want you all to pay attention to some of these things that may seem like they don't matter, but at the end of the day, most of them come home to roost. And so we are always delighted to be a part of your day, even when we're not as bouncy as we would hope to be every time.
You watching anything?
I'm watching everything. the whole play is what happens with the government shutdown and the Comey indictment. I think those two will kind of set up the last 4 months of this year. Epstein is successfully off the radar right now. Maybe watching Gaza a bit. A lot of unrest in Israel about what's going on there. But I think just domestically, those two are the ones that are going to affect us the most, because whatever happens to the budget, then it ripples down into our communities, and dealing with that is what we're going to have next. How about you?
Yeah, exactly what you said. So that's what we're watching. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. The strength of this country isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
So thanks for joining us. As always, remember we're here for you. Look for a link to the show notes to provide feedback or suggest topics. We do actually listen to you. We try and get better every week. I hope you join us next week, wherever you listen. And as always, go forth, do good, and for heaven's sakes, be kind to one another.